I don't know about you and where you're at in life, but prayer is kind of a loaded word. For me, it just conjures up feelings. It conjures up and brings about experiences. And what I would love for us to do tonight is I would love to share with you just my experience that I've had with prayer. For me, when I was growing up, I heard about prayer. I, in fact, did pray. More often than not, it was usually right before I went to bed or right before I would eat food. And it wasn't until I really accepted Christ for the first time that I realized the power of prayer. I realized that it was a conversation with God. I realized that God was initiating this conversation. He wasn't just up in the clouds, leaving me on my own, but he was actually trying to communicate with me and that I could communicate with him. And so I began to just naturally have this conversation with God, because I think in simplest terms, that's what prayer is. It's a conversation that we have with God. But a lot of times in that conversation, it can get complicated, it can get complex. We're confused as to, is there a proper way to pray? Should I be praying for certain things? Is anything off limits when it comes to the conversation that I have with God? I started to wrestle with some of these questions. And I know for some of us today, I think we view prayer and we view God almost like a vending machine, right? Or we view God as a genie. So the only time we ever go to him in prayer is when we want something or that we need something. Maybe something happens in our life that is out of our control, and so the natural thing to do is to, God, if you're there, if you get me out of this, I promise I won't do it again. Have any of you ever been there before? I've been there plenty of times. You don't have to raise your hand. But I know for a fact, hey, if you did, more power to you. I think we've all been in the same boat before. When things have gotten outside of our control, and so it seems like the only thing to do is to pray. And I just think that is so interesting that that's intrinsic in us. That when things get outside of our control, the thing that we have to do is we have to go back and rely and depend on God. But what would it look like for us to rely and depend on God every single day? And the way that we show we rely and we depend on him is by interacting with him, by existing with him, and by talking with him. And so that's my challenge for us in this series, is for us to begin to have the conversation with God. And it's not us starting it. In fact, God starts the conversation. That's what we're going to talk about next week, high school students, and the following week, middle school students. Is that God starts the conversation. We never muster up the words by ourselves, and we're just, starting a brand new conversation. God has been in touch and in tune with you. He's been walking alongside you. And he's been trying to communicate with you, and he wants you to communicate with him. And so that's the challenge that I have for us in this series, is I pray that this series and this time that we could get to spend on prayer would be really, really impactful, because I think that there is so much power in prayer. And if you are here today and you feel like your walk with Christ has maybe gotten a little stale or a little stagnant, I've been there, and I've been there recently. And I really believe that there's so much power in prayer, and that good things can happen when we open ourselves up before God. And so what I would love to do is I would love to be open and transparent before you. I would love to share my experience that I've had with prayer, because it's been up and down. And I know for some of you, I've shared some of these stories before, but I think it's important as we kick off the series that I be open and vulnerable, transparent, that you understand that, hey, I'm in charge, technically, this is my job, to lead you guys. But that doesn't mean that I'm on a pedestal and that I'm better than any of you, because I'm not. And that doesn't mean that I haven't gone through my fair share of experiences. And I know the adult leaders can testify. They have been through their own struggle with prayer and with God. And, not to oust anyone, but I'm sure some of the older adult leaders, right? I'm only 23. Right? And so some of them got a little bit of age on them. So I'm sure, twice my age. Goodness gracious. Yeah. Maybe. I don't know. You guys are young. You guys are young at heart. And you guys are young. It's great. I'm just kidding. I'm just being awkward now. But anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and just share with you guys the experience that I've had with prayer. So for me, like I mentioned before, prayer really started to come alive in my life when I really decided to follow Jesus. I realized that if I was going to live out this faith thing, that I probably should be communicating with God and spending time with him. And of course, a part of that is prayer. I think sometimes prayer can be compartmentalized to a certain part of the day, but I really began to learn what it looked like to devote myself to prayer. And with any situation that would come my way, I would pray, whether it be under my breath, whether it would be out loud, whether it would be with a group of people or wherever. I would try to take every opportunity that I could to pray. And this was coming out of a genuine love and passion to see God move in my life and in the lives of those people around me. Like I said, I started to follow Jesus when I just finished up my sophomore year of high school. But it just so happened, and I didn't realize this at the time, but a lot of bad things would start to happen to me after I followed Jesus. Now, this isn't like, I don't mean to scare you guys with this, but this is just my personal experience. A couple months after I started to follow Jesus, I was really excited. My friends and I, we decided, hey, we're gonna start a Bible study because we were passionate. We wanted to see God move in our lives. So we started this Bible study. We got really close. I had a great group of guy friends that we just did life together. We had Bible studies together, but we also did some mischievous things. And we played sports together. We ate food together. We did all this. And one day in March of 2013, I got a text message that one of my good friends who was in this Bible study and in my friend group, I got a text that he was in a car accident on his way home from track practice. And so we were just like, oh man, like this is crazy. Heard it was serious. He was getting lifeline to Fort Wayne to be in the hospital over there. And so I text all my guy friends that are in my friend group and were in my Bible study. I'm like, hey, let's get together and pray. Because again, it was a thing that was outside of our control. We knew that God was involved in our lives and that he was calling us to pray. And so that's what we did. So we got together in my house. I was wearing a bathrobe at the time. You don't need to know that, but that was just like very vivid memory that I have. I was wearing a bathrobe. We were just huddled up and we were praying. Like, it sounds silly, but like, even with our friend like being involved in this car accident, it was very serious. We were just stoked that we get to get together and we get to pray for our friend on our behalf. We ended up getting another text message that we were going to have a prayer vigil at our local high school. And it was so cool to see both believers and non-believers, students, teachers, family, administrators. Like, we were circling this field house lobby and we were praying for my friend Kaylin. And it was such a beautiful moment. I'll never forget it. I was on my way home and I got a text from my football coach at the time. And he said, Adam, he's with the Lord now. Pray for his family. And I remember that's like one of the first major losses that I ever had in my life. It was a tragic story. It was a tragic reality. And I remember just being so confused and so hurt because I just spent so much time and energy praying to God. God, would you please save my friend? And then I find out that he passed away. Maybe you're here today and you've gone through, maybe not a death, but you've been through a life experience where you said, God, if you love me, why would you let this happen? I really wrestled with that. For me, it was so tough and it almost paralyzed my prayer life. Because I started to wrestle with questions like, well, if is God even real? If he is real, like, what's the point of praying? If God already knows what's going to happen, then why pray at all? Did I mess up? Did I do something wrong? What's going on here? I don't understand. And that was the start for me of really just wrestling. What is prayer? What's the point of it? Why should I, as a Christ follower, do it? And it began a long journey for me of trying to discover exactly what prayer is and what's the purpose of it, how to do it, and all this stuff. And so again, I don't know where you're coming from tonight. Maybe you're on fire and you're passionate. Maybe you're checking things out. Maybe you're right where I was at my junior year. Or maybe you've been hurt and or you're just confused and you're trying to figure things out. But for me, I've just come to realize that there's so much power in prayer. I don't have to have all the answers. And like I said, simply, it's us having a conversation with God. And I know the adult leaders and myself would love to have more specific conversations if you're wrestling with certain questions or doubts. Sometimes, honestly, this is just a really sucky answer, but we just can't explain why things happen. We live in a broken and a fallen world. We talked about that a couple weeks ago in our Simple Gospel series, that since sin entered the world, it fractures the relationship we have. Death and illness and confusion as a result of the fall and of sin entering into the world. And so sometimes we can't explain why things happen. We see this in the book of Job. When we read through the book of Job, God never gives Job an answer as to why he's going through all these trials. But the beautiful thing that I found in the book of Job, as I was wrestling with all this, is that God invites Job into a wrestling match. He allows Job to wrestle with him and to bring all of his thoughts, his confusions, and his feelings before God. The moment God kind of retaliates is when Job questions his ability to run the universe, which I thought was kind of, funny, right? Because it's just like, you're bad at your job. And he's like, oh, really? Well, brace yourself like a man. Were you there? And it's all this other stuff. Yeah, it's really cool. But the beautiful thing is that God can handle our doubts. God can handle our questions. God invites us into a wrestling match so we can go before God with our thoughts, with our doubts, with our confusions, and with our feelings, and we can process them before Him. And He's going to be faithful to enter into the conversation and give you exactly what you need. Now for me, fast forward, I'm in college now. I didn't leave the faith after this tragic circumstance. There were some other things that happened. I won't go too deep into that. But I want to share some other stories that I have about prayer. It was my junior year, and for those of you who don't know, I was a cheerleader in college. Yes, cheerleading is a sport. Some cheerleading is a sport, but I remember God sort of placing it on my heart that I was to lead a devotional, or I was supposed to lead a Bible study at Nationals. So Nationals is where 12 teams from all over the country gather together to compete. It's really tense. I mean, it's sports, right? So you're not there to be buddy-buddy and have camaraderie. You're there to compete. But I remember thinking to myself, no, this could be a great time to spend time in the Word and to pray for one another before we start this competition. And so I remember I was texting my professors, I was texting my family. I'm like, hey, pray for this. And we, me and my teammates, we went out and we invited other teams to come join us. And we were just so excited. I remember the night before I was praying, I was like, Lord, please just allow some teams to show up and allow them to be affected by the message that you placed on my heart. I was so excited. We get there the next morning, and guess who was there? Just our team. No other team showed up. No coaching staff, no athletic training staff, no teammates. And I remember being so frustrated. I was like, oh, God, I just spent so much time praying that you would do this, but it didn't happen. And so I was really wrestling with the expectations and the frustration that I had. And I was like, Lord, I trust that this is ultimately for your good, that you are going to use this and that you're going to do with it what you will. God, I let my expectations get in the way. I was expecting so many people to show up. And since no one else showed up, I thought it was a failure. But it was far from it. It was a beautiful time that I got to spend with our team. But I remember thinking at that time, man, God, you didn't answer. Fast forward now to my senior year. I was asked to speak at the athletic commissioning service at my college. And so it's a time where all the athletic teams get to come together and pray. All the athletes are there, the coaches are there, athletic training staff's there, the dean of the chapel's there, the university president is there. It's a big deal. So I remember being asked to do this, and I was freaking out. I was not I was excited, but I was so nervous because I'm like, Lord, what do you want me to share? And I remember asking God, because again, a conversation with God is not just a monologue. It's not just us talking. It's also us listening and waiting on God. And I remember just, not in an audible voice, but just kind of the thought running through my head was, you need to offer a time of baptism. Baptism is an outward sign of an inward change where you are publicly declaring that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior. And so I was like, okay, but I need to know what to say. So I'm praying, Lord, if this baptism is something that you want to do, I pray that it would happen. But God, I need to get to the real matter. I need to know what I'm going to say because I feel like that's what's most important. And you're saying, no, I need you to pray. So I spent some time praying, and I was really wrestling with the message. Fast forward, the time comes. I give my message, and during my message, I said, maybe for some of you, the next step is a step of baptism. Now, this was not like an altar call. This wasn't like a time of baptism. This was just like a pep rally, if you will, before like the school year starts up. Like baptism was not like a thing really that happened during these times, but I felt God prompt me to do it, so I said, yeah, let's do it. So I get done, and I remember praying because, remember, junior year is still in the back of my mind of like, no one showed up. So God, I need you to show up and I need you to work. Nothing is in me that can make anyone do anything. God, it's all you, and I'm leaving this in your hands. So after the service, one of the softball players comes up to me and she says, Adam, I want to get baptized. And I'm like, dude, let's go. Like, I'm so excited at this point because she took the next step. And I saw God was answering my prayer. And when God answers prayer, oh boy, I get excited. And so I was like, let's go, let's do this. And then one of my teammates texted me and was like, hey, I want to get baptized too. I'm like, let's go. We're going to the rec pool. We're doing this. And so at the end of the night, 8 people got baptized. It was so phenomenal. It's one memory that I will cherish forever and always. But it all started in prayer. It started with God prompting me to say, Adam, I want you to pray. And there's a whole lot of baggage for me that came with prayer. All the questions, concerns, doubts that I had. God, you hadn't shown up before. Will you show up this time? And God was just asking me to pray. And God was faithful. And he still is faithful. So yeah, prayer is confusing. It can be difficult at times to understand. But I hope we can always remember that God is not off in the distance, but he is near to each and every one of us, and he's communicating to us. So are you open and are you willing to say yes to God and to enter into the conversation? Because Jesus, God, is waiting to have a conversation with you. He is the means in which we can live an empowered life. We talked about this last week, but we can't live out a supernatural faith in the natural. We need God in our life. It doesn't just fall on us. We do have a responsibility, but God is working all things together. And so for us, are we up to the challenge? Are we up to saying, yes, I'm going to enter in this conversation, and I'm going to devote my life to prayer? That's the question and the tension that I want us to kind of wrestle with.